Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 26, verse 27, which reads, "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them." So, I want to look at this verse in particular because this is only 3 verses after Solomon warned us about the enemy who disguises their true intentions behind smooth words. Right? And he arrives at what happens to that enemy when the disguise eventually fails and the schemes they were running finally reach their destination. And so I think it's important to note that Proverbs 26:27 is not a random observation about karma, but it is the natural conclusion of a sequence of observations about deception, malice, and the harboring of ill intent toward others. I think it answers the question that Proverbs 26:24 implicitly raises. If enemies are disguising themselves and harboring deceit, what happens to them? I think the answer is one of the most vivid and memorable images in all of the wisdom literature. The pit they dug for someone else is the pit they fall into. Right? The stone they set rolling toward another person rolls back and crushes them. 2 images, right? 2 mechanisms, 1 consistent principle. The schemes of the wicked are not merely ineffective, but they are self-defeating. The trap laid for another person becomes the trap that catches the one who laid it. And I think this is a principle that shows up in enough places, both in scripture and in observable human experience, that it deserves more than a casual nod. Solomon is not making a pious wish, but he is describing a pattern in the moral structure of reality that is as consistent as any principle he articulates anywhere else in Proverbs. So let's break down the verse. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. So the image of digging a pit is actually, or as a metaphor for laying a trap or a scheme against another person, is actually ancient and appears all throughout the Old Testament. In the physical world of ancient Israel, pits were used as traps for animals, concealed beneath camouflage so that the animal would step onto what appeared to be solid ground and fall through the pit below. And applied to human scheming, the pit represents any deliberate, carefully constructed plan designed to cause harm to a specific target, whether through deception, manipulation, false accusation, or the engineering of circumstances intended to damage another person. The claim of the first half of the verse is not that pit digging is wrong necessarily, though it clearly is, but it is that pit digging is structurally self-defeating. The person who digs the pit falls into it. Not might fall, not sometimes falls, but just falls. And the principle is stated with the same unqualified certainty we saw in Proverbs 22:8 sowing and reaping declaration. The outcome is built into the activity. And so the mechanism by which this happens, I think, is worth thinking through carefully because understanding it makes the principle more than just a moral platitude. When a person invests significant energy in constructing a scheme against another person, several things happen simultaneously that they do not intend. Right? They develop habits of deception and manipulation that eventually operate against their own interests. They construct a social and relational environment in which trust is eroded because the scheming mentality does not stay contained to its original target. They position themselves in active opposition to the moral order that God has embedded in reality, which, as Proverbs 21:30 established, means they are working against something that will not ultimately yield to their efforts. And they build structures whose complexity tends to collapse on the builder when the variables they could not fully control assert themselves. Right? And the biblical record is full of precise illustrations of this principle. Haman in the book of Esther is perhaps the most complete and most dramatic example in the entire Old Testament. For context, he constructed an elaborate scheme against Mordecai, going so far as to build a specific gallows designed for Mordecai's execution. The sequence of events that follows is almost darkly comedic in how precisely the reversal tracks with Proverbs 26:27. Haman he ends up hanged on the very gallows he built for Mordecai at the command of the very king whose favor he was cultivating, in a reversal engineered by the very people he was scheming to destroy. And so he dug the pit, but he fell into it. And that precision of the reversal is not accidental in the narrative, but it is the point. Psalm 7, 15 to 16 expresses the same principle in the devotional literature with language that is almost identical to Proverbs 26, 27. It says, he makes a pit, digging it out, and falls into the hole that he has made. His mischief returns upon his own head, and on his own school his violence descends. The returning upon his own head is the rolling stone of the second half of our verse. The structure is identical. The pit and the violence return to their source. The scheme reverses direction. Daniel 6 provides another precise illustration. The officials who conspired against Daniel, who engineered the law that was designed specifically to trap him through his own faithfulness in prayer, ended up in the very lion's den they had prepared for him. They dug the pit, they fell into it, and the reversal is so consistent across these narratives that it reads less like coincidence and actually more like the working out of a principle that is simply built into the moral structure of reality. The verse goes on to say, if someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. And so the second image actually shifts from concealed traps to active directed force. Right? Rolling a stone at someone is a more aggressive image than digging a pit. Where the pit relies on concealment and the victim's unsuspecting step, the rolling stone is a weapon set in motion toward a target with force and direction. It represents the active deployment of harm rather than the passive trap. The reversal described in the second half follows the same logic as the first. The stone rolls back the one who set it in motion. Right? The force that was directed toward another person returns to its source. And the damage that was intended for the target arrives instead at the place of origin. This image of the reversing stone draws on the physics of momentum and direction in a way that makes the moral principle feel almost natural law-like. But in the physical world, a stone set rolling on a slope can roll back if the terrain changes. But in the moral world, right, a force set in motion against another person carries within it the seeds of its own reversal. Not always visibly, not always immediately, but with the reliability that Proverbs consistently attributes to the moral consequences of wickedness. Proverbs 26:27 is not standing alone in making this claim. Even later on in Proverbs 28:10, it develops the same principle with slightly different imagery. It says, whoever misleads the upright into an evil way will fall into his own pit, but the blameless will have a goodly inheritance. The falling into the own pit is an explicit echo of our verse, and its pairing with the inheritance of the blameless reinforces that the reversal is not just the destruction of the wicked, but rather the vindication of the righteous. The pit that catches the schemer in the same pit that the blameless person was spared from walking into. Even Ecclesiastes 10:8-9, right? That book, it's another wisdom literature book, and it provides what reads almost like a collection of similar principles stated in rapid sequence. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. And so the pattern extends beyond the moral domain into a general observation about how the dangers inherent in certain activities tend to return to the person engaged in them. But in the moral context of Proverbs 26, the specific application of schemes against others is the primary point. And so the New Testament framing of this principle is most fully developed in Galatians 6:7-8, which we have referenced earlier in the series. It says, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. And so when it says God is not mocked, I think it is the theological foundation of Proverbs 26-27. The person who digs a pit for another person is, in some sense, attempting to mock the moral order that God has established and oversees. And that moral order does not yield to the attempt. It reverses it. The pit becomes a judgment on the one who dug it because God is not willing to allow the structures of wickedness to operate permanently and successfully against the innocent. So let's get practical here. Let's get applicable because, I truly believe that turning knowledge into action is one of the most important parts of our Christian walk. So the first thing is to let this principle genuinely deter us from schemes that seem clever in the short term. I think the most direct application of Proverbs 26:27 is as a true deterrent, right? And, the reason I say that is because when we are tempted to engineer someone else's downfall, to construct a scheme that positions another person for harm while concealing our own involvement, the principle of this verse offers the most practically useful counter-argument available. Not just that it is wrong, though it is, but that it is structurally self-defeating. Right? The pit we are digging has our name on it. The stone we are setting in motion is going to come back. And so whatever the short-term satisfaction of the scheme, the long-term trajectory of it runs directly back towards us. I think that's not a vague moral warning, but it is a description of how the moral structure of reality actually functions. And I think taking it seriously in the moment of temptation is one of the most practical applications of wisdom available to us. Second thing, find genuine comfort in this principle when we are the target of someone else's schemes. The flip side of the deterrent application is the comfort this verse offers to anyone who is currently experiencing the pit digging of an adversary. If the principle is real, then the scheme being constructed against us carries within it the seeds of its own reversal. That does not mean we should be passive in the face of genuine harm, or that we should never pursue appropriate accountability for wrongdoing directed at us. But it does mean that we do not have to carry the anxiety of believing that the scheme will ultimately succeed. Psalm 37:12-13, which we have referenced multiple times, frames this comfort with characteristic directness. The wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes his teeth at him. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he sees that his day is coming. Right? The laughter of the Lord is not cruelty, but it is the settled confidence of the one who knows the pit and the stone are going to return to their source. And the third thing is to examine whether any of our current strategies toward people who have wronged us are functioning as pits we are digging. This is the application, I think, that requires the most honesty, because the pit digging of Proverbs 26:27 does not always look dramatic, right? It does not always involve the elaborate construction of Haman's gallows. Sometimes it looks like the subtle engineering of a situation designed to make someone else look bad. Sometimes it looks like the careful cultivation of a narrative about a person that positions them unfavorably in the eyes of others. Sometimes it even looks like the strategic withholding of information or opportunity that we could provide, but are deliberately holding back to disadvantage someone who has wronged us. And all of these are versions of pit digging, and all of them carry the same structural reversal built into them. I think examining honestly whether any of our current strategies toward people we are in conflict with are pits we are digging for ourselves is one of the more uncomfortable but genuinely important applications of this passage. So with that being said, let me just give a closing thought here. Proverbs 26:27 is clearly a verse about the built-in integrity of the moral order. It is not primarily a verse about karma, which is an impersonal mechanical concept that we don't believe in, but it is a verse about the active oversight of a God who does not allow the structures of wickedness to operate permanently and successfully against the innocent, and who has embedded into the very fabric of moral reality a consistent tendency for schemes to return to their source. Look, the pit was dug for someone else. The stone was rolled towards someone else, but the moral order that God oversees does not cooperate with the plan, it reverses it. And the person who intended to catch someone else in a trap discovers, with the consistency that every biblical illustration of this principle demonstrates, that they are the ones who fell. So look, dig no pits, set no stones in motion that you would not want rolling back towards you, because they will.